Good morning, mothers. Good morning. Let's see, is that the right spot? There we are. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Let's try that again. We're trying to get the mic right. Hi. Thank you, Roxanne. You're very good at that. You're hired. All right, let's try this again. Good morning.
Good morning.
Just the men this time. Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to the Low Country Book Club Convention. How many of you were with us last year or the previous year? Have been to this event before? Thank you all so much for coming back. That's fantastic. Where are the first timers then? Oh, look at that. That's incredible. So glad to have you all with us here today as well. I'm Jonathan Haupt. I'm the director of the Pat Conroy Literary Center. It's a pleasure to welcome you all here today. I hope you'll stick it out with us all day. We've got a fantastic lineup of events of authors and literary arts leaders here to talk to you about the care and feeding of a book club. And one more question for you. How many of you are members of a book club? Look at that. That's fantastic. Well, this is a thing that we put together for you. And also for those of you who are not yet members, but might in time wish to be a member. Yes, ma'am. Question already.
I just wanted to not a question, a statement. I wanted to say last year at this convention, they asked a question, was there anyone who didn't belong to a book club?
Yeah.
And we invited Jen, and she's been a member of our book club for a year now.
Oh, congratulations, Jen.
And we love her.
Oh. We're like the Match.com of book clubs. So if there's anybody here today not yet a member of a book club but would like to be, you might make your connection here today too. We certainly hope so. So we, the Pat Conroy Literary Center, have our own monthly book club that we started a few months back, taking all of Mr. Conroy's books, all 12 of them, in order. And since we had the Low Country Book Club convention scheduled, we thought, wouldn't it be fun if we incorporated one of those monthly book club sessions into the convention? And that's what we're about to do. That's our kickoff session today. So here to introduce that session and our first speaker this morning is the member of Team Conroy who was born most recently. This is our high school student intern, Holland Perriman. Holland, come on up, introduce.
Good morning. So the first program of the day will be led by Margaret Evans discussing Pat Conroy's book, Beach Music. Margaret Evans is the former assistant to Pat Conroy and is now the editor and publisher of Beaufort, South Carolina's Low Country Weekly, where she pens her South Carolina Press Association award-winning column Rants and Raves. Let's give a warm welcome to Margaret Evans.
My over-preparation here. Thanks.
Thanks, Holland. I think I'm going to sit up here or stand up here or something. So I'm not really going to give a speech. Jonathan asked me to lead a discussion. And I noticed in the literature when I was looking it over that this is supposed to be a model about how to run a good book club session. And yeah, I didn't figure that out till late in the game. And it made me laugh because I am a member of a book club. Where are some of my sisters? There's one, Lolita. Okay, the rest of them are out there dealing with books because it's Lori Anderson. Oh, there's Mara. Hi, Mara. Tammy. Anyway, several of them are here. We're the Mockingbird Book Club, and we're a great book club, but we're terrible role models for how to run a good book club. Aren't we terrible role models? Because we cannot stick to a schedule. We can't even stick to a book list. We try really hard to come up with our books 6 months in advance to a year in advance, and then we're constantly veering away. We'll come to a meeting and go, oh, y'all, I don't feel like reading that after all. Let's read this instead. Some of us don't always read the whole book. But we always have a great time. We're great friends. We've been in the book club for probably 10 years now. And the fact that we're all great friends might be the problem. We don't really hold each other accountable like some less chummy book clubs do. But anyway, in terms of how we run a session in the Mockingbird Book Club, that too is usually very informal. We show up at somebody's house. pour a bunch of wine, sit on the floor or around the coffee table, and we say things like, so what'd y'all think? Sometimes somebody will print off a list of questions, and that's helpful. I have tons of questions that I printed off about beach music, which we may or may not get to because you guys might have questions. I hope you do. Before I get started, the only thing that does kind of qualify me to run this session more than, say, maybe some of y'all, is that I did actually work with Pat Conroy on beach music many, many years ago. I was his research assistant, and I thought I would read a little bit of a column I wrote a few years ago to give you some background about my relationship or pre-relationship or pre-relationship with Pat Conroy, how it all got started. I wrote this a few years ago right before Pat's 70th birthday when we were giving him a big shindig at USCB. Can y'all hear me, everybody? Okay, this is called Deconstructing Pat Conroy. I first heard the name Pat Conroy as a young graduate student at the University of Alabama. It was the late 80s. I was fresh out of Swanee, a kind of English major's paradise, and deconstruction was suddenly all the rage in the rarefied world of literary criticism. If you've never heard that word, deconstruction, consider yourself lucky. Just seeing it in print still makes me shudder, and to this day, I couldn't quite define it for you. All I knew at that tender and impressionable point in my intellectual development was that I was supposed to grasp this concept, this deconstruction, and I didn't, not really. I didn't understand how language could be divorced from its cultural and historical context, or how you could possibly consider a text apart from its author's life experience, ideas, or intentions. More important, I couldn't figure out for the life of me why anybody would want to. Deconstruction seemed pretentious and pointless to me, like the most naked emperor ever. But the powers that were back then, in our English department anyway, insisted otherwise. The result for this insecure young scholar was frustration, disillusionment, loss of self-confidence, and worst of all, a greatly diminished love of literature. The only reason, let's see if is this right?
Yeah, it's good. Yeah.
The sole reason I'd come for my master's in the first place. I was lost. Enter the Prince of Tides. My roommate in Tuscaloosa, a friend from home, was studying for her master's in elementary education. And while I wrestled joylessly in the quicksand of critical theory, dutifully deconstructing what others had so lovingly constructed, she was doing fun things like making paper dolls. Seriously, I clearly remember a paper doll project and how envious I was. My roommate also had plenty of time to read for pleasure. All my reading back then was distinctly devoid of such. And one weekend, she shut herself up in her room with this hefty novel called The Prince of Tides by a writer I'd never heard of. When she finally emerged, wrung out and tear-stained, she placed the book in my hands with great solemnity and said, "You have to read this. It's the best book I've ever read." To say I devoured it is not quite right. You can't devour something that keeps compelling you backward to reread sentences and paragraphs, whole pages even, for the sheer delight of the experience. So I consumed it slowly, sensuously, like some extravagant buffet laid out before a parched and starving soul. The pages were dripping with delicious words, not cold, empty signifiers. The language was rich in beauty and meaning, the narrative inextricably entwined with the setting, the author's singular voice, his very self, resonating through every page. As I read, I didn't deconstruct. I just savored. I didn't take the book apart like some science project or break it down into something less than the sum of its parts. I just relished it. I read like a reader, not a scholar. And with this book, this one book, my lifelong love of literature was restored, reconstructed, you might say. I've known Pat Conroy for over 20 years now, and I don't think I ever thanked him for that. Now, this was 5 years ago, at least. The following year, The Prince of Tides made its way onto the syllabus of Don Noble's Southern Lit class at Alabama, and I blushed with pride knowing this writer I'd discovered, this Pat Conroy, was taken seriously by the serious people. No longer a scholar's guilty pleasure, he was canon material. I could come out of the closet. When I ended up moving to the Low Country a few years later, I'd left academia and, yay, deconstruction behind me, but had read every Pat Conroy book there was to read. And while I somehow refrained from stalking the man, I felt a crackle in the air just knowing he was my neighbor on Fripp Island long before I actually met him there. And I remember that occasion vividly. It was sunset on the beach, and we were part of a group who gathered to watch a nest of loggerhead hatchlings make their harrowing run for the ocean. It was like something out of a Pat Conroy novel. Anyway, that goes on and on, as I tend to do. But what happened after that was that I threw myself at Pat Conroy on the beach that night. There were a lot of other witnesses there. It wasn't untoward, but I did tell him that I was his greatest fan and asked him if he had any work I could do for him. I was in my 20s, he was in his 40s, and I said, I'll type for you, I'll do research for you, I'll empty your trash, whatever you need, and I'll do it for free. And he sort of laughed and said, well, I'd pay you, kid. And I don't like this. And as a matter of fact, I do need a research assistant. How soon can you start? I know, it was like every girl's dream come true. So yes, that happened, and I guess I started the next day. And for about 2 years, I would go to Pat's house about once a week, and he would give me a list of questions that needed to be run down, and they were all over the place. Sometimes they were a date he needed to track down. Not a date, but a date. He was married at the time, but not to Cassandra. I think she's in here somewhere. Anyway, he would give me things to run down. Sometimes I'd have to go to the library in town. Sometimes I'd have to make phone calls. This was before the internet. I don't know if people even use research assistants anymore now that we have the internet, but I'm glad we didn't then. One part of my job that I remember vividly was he gave me a big sack of cassette tapes, and on these cassette tapes were interviews that he had done, not by him, but by someone else he had hired. He had someone go around Atlanta and interview the adult children of Holocaust survivors. So he had a bag of about 10 or 12 cassette tapes, and he asked me to listen to these tapes and take notes on what these adult children of Holocaust survivors said about what it was like to grow up in that household. And he wanted me to take notes on themes and trends and things that they repeated. And that was a pretty harrowing experience. I was a fairly young woman who I knew about the Holocaust, certainly, but I had never come that close to it before. So that's the most memorable part of the job, and I suppose the notes that I gave him on that went to inform the character of Shyla in Beach Music. Can I see a show of hands? Who has actually read Beach Music in this room? Oh, that's awesome. Okay, who has read it recently? Okay, not as good, but there's still some. I did reread Beach Music for the first time since it came out in 1995. I reread it this sort of slowly over the summer because I had several other books I had to read at the same time. So the first part of the book is now less vivid in my mind than the last part of the book. But for most of you who haven't read it since it came out, I guess that I'm still better off than y'all are. Wow, it's a very long book. Did y'all remember how long? Do y'all remember how long that book is? Well, when it first came out in 1995, I was a little bit disappointed because so much of it had been left on the cutting room floor. Believe it or not, when I was working for Pat, another part of my job was to, every time he finished a chapter, and y'all know he wrote his chapters by hand, he was famous for not typing, But it was even more convoluted back then because he would give me a chapter, and it was my job to go get that chapter photocopied and then FedEx it off to his longtime typist in Atlanta, who he had been using for like 20 years or something, because he was a very loyal person. And so every time he gave me a chapter, I of course read it. I felt like I was sitting in the catbird seat. I was like, really? I'm the first person reading these chapters? And so many of them did not make it into the book that ended up coming out. And I was doing some reading before this, and I found out that the original manuscript was something like, was over 2,000 pages long. Yeah. And I think we ended up getting about half of that. It's what ended up being, I mean, we have a 600-something page book, but his big handwriting made it longer. So anyway, I'm glad that a lot of it hit the cutting room floor. I think it would have been too long otherwise, but I'm not sure I like the parts that got left out. I remember some beautiful writing about Italy that got left out, and I just went to Italy for the first time 2 years ago, and it reminded me of the beautiful Italy writing that got left out. But let's see where I wanted to go with this. Reading through this book the second time was very personal for me. Not only did it, remind me of Pat, because he is Jack McCall basically, and it made me miss Pat. But so many things have changed for me since then, and I kept thinking, oh my gosh, I wish I'd worked on this with Pat now instead of back then, because back then I had never been to Italy. I had never been to Rome or Venice, and so I'm reading these pages and I'm just crying over how beautiful his descriptions of Venice and Rome are. And now I've been there, and I could have actually, talked to him about that. And now I know what it's like to love a daughter. I didn't have any children back then. I didn't know what it was like to love a child, especially a daughter, like Jack McCall loves Leah. And, back then in my 20s, I knew plenty about World War II, but I wasn't that interested, and I certainly wasn't interested in Poland. But now suddenly my daughter is an exchange student in the Czech Republic, and she's living 9 miles from the Polish border, and she's living an hour from Auschwitz. And I keep thinking, Pat would love this. He'd be able to give me all these tips, and so he loved Amelia. He always called her the Mimi bird. That's my daughter, and he'd be so proud that she was doing that. So for me, all that was very personal. And now y'all would probably like to talk about the book, right? Yeah. I mean, I've got all these many pages of what people have said about the book, and also questions that people have put together for book clubs and things like that. There was a really interesting article in I think this was in the Washington Post when the book came out. A man wrote a long, beautiful piece about Pat and the writing of beach music and the process. And what's so interesting for me is that there was all this stuff going on in Pat's life when he was working on this book and living on Fripp Island. And I was working for him, but I didn't know about all the stuff that was going on in his life. And this Washington Post piece says, it was a winding, torturous process for Conroy, whose writing is as much self-help therapy as it is literature. Beach music was first delayed by the success of The Prince of Tides and subsequent motion picture obligations. Then came the pressure to duplicate its success, 51 weeks on the bestseller list, and to match its great leap forward in skill from his past work. Then came money problems, the dissolution of his second marriage, a back operation, and a nervous breakdown with thoughts of suicide. Finally, the thing that threatened to wreck the book and the author, the suicide of his troubled youngest brother, Tom, who jumped from an 18-story building in Columbia, South Carolina, last August. Now, this was written in '95. He was 33. So I was already no longer working for Pat by the time the death of Tom happened. And of course, I did know about that. But what I didn't know while I was working for him was that he was going through the dissolution of his marriage. I knew he was living alone in his house on Fripp Island and that his wife, Lenore, was in San Francisco, but I did not know that they were separated. I thought he was just working on his book because he was way late in finishing it. So he certainly was not pouring his soul out to me, but he was pouring his soul out to his therapist over on Hilton Head. And I had a lot of, I feel bad, but I did not know what was going on with him at the time. So that's why it took him like 9 years to get Beach Music out. As for the book itself, this article talks a lot about how it incorporates Conroy's signature sense of place, everywhere from Rome, as we discussed, to, I don't think he ever describes anywhere as well as he describes the South Carolina Low Country, and that's all through this book. I really don't want to just talk. I want y'all to ask questions before I start asking y'all questions. Are there, good, somebody's raising their hand back there. Hey.
Can you read, is that available, those chapters that didn't make it? Beach Music?
Oh, I don't know. I've never heard that those are available. Does anybody know? Do you know if there are like chapters that didn't? Did the archives have that in South Carolina?
It would be at USC in Columbia.
Okay.
Oh, a 3-volume uncut version. I would buy it.
Who would buy the 3-volume uncut version? I see some hands being raised. Yeah, no, I kind of wish I had hung on to those chapters now. I could probably get rich, but no, I've always, I worked for Pat again right before he died for about 2 or 3 years, and I was his typist at that point. I guess he somehow, either his old typist passed away or I don't know what happened, but I had all these chapters. I kept thinking, like, can I secretly keep one of these chapters? But in the end, I gave them all back because they do belong in Pat's archives. Anyway, so, okay, you wanted to know if there was a place to read the parts that were cut. I don't know. Jonathan says possibly in the archives at USC, not USCB. That would be convenient, but it's in Columbia. Does anybody want to express an opinion about the book? The book came out to sort of mixed reviews. Like, the New York Times did not like it. The Washington Post did like it. Let me read you the Publisher's Weekly review that I think this is a fairly good summation. Publishers Weekly said, when the book came out, booksellers and other vitally interested parties can quit holding their collective breath. Conroy has not lost his touch. His storytelling powers have not failed. Neither has his poetic skill with words nor his vivid imagination. His long-awaited 6th book sings with the familiar elegiac southern cadences. His prose is sweepingly lyrical, if sometimes melodramatic, unabashedly sentimental, if sometimes indigestibly schmaltzy. The hero, Jack McCall, describes himself as a man on the run from his past, the suicide of his beloved wife, the destructive influence of his icy, manipulative mother and mean, bullying, alcoholic father, the betrayal of his youthful ideals, his faith in the Catholic Church, his boyhood friends. There is, of course, the familiar theme of dysfunctional families. In addition to the McCalls, 2 other family units vie for the dubious title of most messed up. But Conroy has added a new element here by dramatizing his conviction that the unbearable wound of Vietnam was our country's spiritual Holocaust. Conroy takes on these emotionally laden issues in chapters so direct and powerful that readers will be moved by his intimacy with the material and perhaps astonished by his authority over it. Conroy meshes complex plot lines with ease. Jack, a food and travel writer, fled with his toddler daughter, Leah, to Rome in 1982 in the wake of his wife Shyla's suicidal jump from a bridge in Charleston, South Carolina, and her parents' subsequent lawsuit to deny him custody of Leah. This is kind of a summary for those who want a refresher. He returns home some years later because of his mother is dying of leukemia. In addition to becoming embroiled in family tension, he begins a slow process of reconciliation with Shyla's parents, who eventually tell him the stories of their respective Holocaust experiences. With his first love, Ladair Ansley, they've written Ashley, but it's Ansley, now a scriptwriter employed by their youthful chum, Mike Hess, to write a screenplay of their growing up years. and with his parents and siblings. He witnesses the return to Waterford of another friend, Jordan Elliott, who has been presumed dead for 18 years after he was accused of murder during a protest against the Vietnam War, and who was betrayed by the fourth member of their boyhood clan, Capers Middleton, who is now running for governor of South Carolina. Though the book suffers from some florid digressions, a fish story that makes Jonah's adventure seem tame, a totally inappropriate shaggy dog tale. I actually love the fish story. It is always passionately sincere. Conroy's dark humor has its usual sardonic edge, and his character's rat-a-tat-tat repartee is laden with casual obscenities and jocular insults. As expected, the characters are larger than life, impossibly beautiful, romantic, witty. In particular, Jack's precocious daughter may seem too mature, sweet, graceful, poised, and smart to be true. In the end, of course, as Jack understands that everybody in his life carries a tragic secret equal to the anguish he bears, he achieves healing in the very community and the very South he had been determined to leave forever. So, who out there who's read it recently has any feelings about any of that? Yes?
I disagree with the author about the dog, Chippy, the great dog.
Chippy the great dog? The great dog Chippy,
The great
right.
dog Chippy. That,
Not to be mistaken with the great Jew,
Yeah.
Max the great Jew.
but Chippy gave
Some of this book is politically incorrect by our day standards. Yeah.
Chippy gave Leah the understanding of what she was missing in the love entry. And unbeknownst to Pat, he was, not Pat, Jack McCall, sorry.
You might as well just be Pat.
Unbeknownst to Jack, he was layering those beautiful memories for Leah through Chippy the great dog. So if we didn't have Chippy...
I like Chippy the great dog. I didn't have a problem with him, and I actually liked the story of the boys lost at sea, too. I thought that was fascinating and harrowing. It sort of showed why they had such a bond, you know, later in life, although they did break up later in life. That Capers Middleton was a piece of work, wasn't it? Okay, anybody else have a quibble with that review or anything to add to that review? Does anybody else think that Pat's books, or this book in particular, tend to be melodramatic or over the top, or do you think that's a yes? Someone is saying yes.
Actually, all Pat's books ended up on top of my favorites.
This is at the top of your favorite?
Yes. So, and I'm trying to remember the details. I read it a few years back, but I thought his Holocaust pieces were the most dramatic and pointed I've probably ever read. It got so intense. My wife was sitting back there. We've done a lot of Holocaust material. Made me turn off that portion, and I had to listen to it myself. We were doing it on the...
Oh, you were audio book. Okay.
Yes, the audio book.
Okay.
Because it got much too intense.
So you had to turn it off for her and listen to it yourself. If you all didn't hear that, he said that for this gentleman here, this is his favorite Pat Conroy book, and he thought the Holocaust sections were particularly powerful and so intense that while he and his wife were listening to it on the audio book version, she had to leave the room, or they had to turn it off so only he could listen to it because it was too intense. And I agree that the Holocaust chapters are incredibly intense, and I found myself crying a lot during this book. I thought the book, for me, my second reading experience that happened over some time this summer, for me it started out a little slow. I couldn't quite get into the rhythm of the book, and I was like, oh man, this is going to be a slog. And then somehow it started picking up. Can I be that honest in here? Now that Pat is no longer with us, no, I'm sorry, Pat. I didn't think that the first time I read it, but no, for me it was a little bit of a slog at first, and then I found myself getting so swept up in it that by the middle of the book I was having a hard time putting it down. Some of the parts that, first of all, if you go on Amazon.com, you will find that this is people's like favorite Pat Conroy book or their least favorite. It's really like wildly swinging back and forth. Some people just think this is his most brilliant work ever, and some people think it was just his worst. There's no real in between. I might be in between in that The Prince of Tides has always been my favorite because it was my first love. So I always say it's my favorite. But I'm not sure that this one didn't. I think the second time I read The Prince of Tides, I didn't love it as much as the first time. And this one I loved more the second time I read it. So that might speak well of beach music, that it held up as well as it did, at least in my opinion. But yeah, people have wildly swinging notions. Yes, ma'am?
But do you know why you call it the book beach music?
I think there are probably a lot of reasons. First of all, the theme of shag dancing is all through the book, and you shag dance to beach music. It's a certain, you might not know that since you're not American by birth, are you? There's a thing called beach music. It's South Carolinian by nature, and you shag dance to it, and the whole book starts out with Shyla and Jack shag dancing in a house that's falling into the sea. So that metaphor, it's a metaphor and a literal image of beach music is all through the book. But there's also, Lucy McCall, his mother, is in love with the ocean and the beach. She's a turtle lady on the Isle of Orion, which I'm assuming is Fripp Island. I met Pat at a turtle watch. So when I read all the parts about Lucy being a turtle lady, that too brought back a lot of memories. Pat was doing his research then. Yes?
When I got my book, it was the first edition, I got the cassette tape
You did?
with the beach music on the front, and it was the beach music.
Oh, it was some
And it
recordings of
yes,
beach
it was
music?
beach music. So
Like,
I don't know if anybody else had
How many
that.
songs?
I don't even remember. In fact, I'm like, I need to find it, but yeah, that was way back
Wow.
at the beginning.
Yeah, I don't think I got one of those. I found my original, I can't believe this mess I've made up here. Yes, I can. I found my original beach music, which I didn't know where it was, which is why I reread it on Kindle. Although I almost always read on Kindle because I read in the middle of the night while my husband's asleep and I like the light. But that's why I have nothing marked in here because I just found it yesterday. But it had this great inscription that I have to read to y'all. Y'all, I don't think I told you that when I was there, lest you think I was having some sort of a dalliance with an older man, I was a newlywed myself, but not to my now husband. I had a starter husband back then. And he was he still is a great guy. There's no animosity, but his name was Chris Hawley, and it still is Chris Hawley. He lives in Charleston now. But while I was working for Pat, Chris taught guitar lessons to Pat. Pat wanted to learn how to play the guitar. So Chris would go over, and Chris is a great guitar player, would go over and teach him. So Pat wrote in this book, and I just found this yesterday, I'd forgotten all about it. To Margaret and Chris Hawley, my fabulous assistant and my guitar teacher, who were friends beyond compare during the writing of this book, and whom I love with my heart. I could not have done it without you. I was just like, I read that to my now husband, and my current husband of 20 years, who is way more my husband than this guy was. But Jeff was like, wow, that's so cool. That was almost 25 years ago. I said, yeah, it feels like a lifetime ago. I don't know why I'm telling y'all all that. Jonathan, this is just what you wanted, isn't it? I better warn Chris Hawley. Okay, let's get back to the book again now. As y'all can see, this has been a very personal experience for me. I see that we've only got 20 minutes left in the session. So y'all want me to just throw out some questions, or do y'all have some questions that you want to throw out about the book? Yes, okay.
If I'm correct, Pat lost his mother in 1983.
Jonathan, you're the official Conroy. Was Pat's mother, did she die in 83? Do you know? That sounds about right. So he was working on this book this book is obviously a big part of it is his mother's death.
And also, he lost his brother about 10 years later.
Yes. Maybe 12 years later, 13 years, 11 years later, yeah. But you know what happened? He had written a suicide scene for John Hardin, the youngest brother, who was a schizophrenic in the book. He had written a suicide scene, or was working on one. He had planned one, and then his actual little brother, Tommy, did commit suicide, and Pat couldn't put a suicide scene in the book. He just couldn't do it, which I completely understand. So that was quite a tragedy. What do you think about the brothers? A lot of critics have said that the brothers don't ring true, that no group of brothers could be that witty and sarcastic and bitching at each other all the time. And I was like, well, y'all haven't been around the Conroy brothers, huh? I don't know. I see Sandra back there. Hi, Sandra. Do you think those brothers ring true?
Absolutely.
She says absolutely. People often say that Pat exaggerates. Oh, Sandra has some. Yes, please. Did y'all hear that? Because I didn't. Can somebody loud say that again?
Have her come to the microphone.
They should be doing that. Yeah, I don't think this will reach over there.
Have her come up.
Sandra, would you like to come up and say that again?
Yes.
Everybody would like for you to. Come on, girl. For those who don't know, and that's probably nobody, this is Pat's wife, Cassandra King Conroy. Here she comes. Come here.
Now tell that story again now.
Okay, I just said that, well, I have to say that Margaret started this off and almost came full circle with talking about deconstruction. And that was one reason the critics were after Pat, because his books actually had plot and imagery in them. And I will try not to be too sarcastic, but it's going to be hard, yeah. But he took, every time he went to Asheville, he took a rose to the grave of Thomas Wolfe and James Dickey later, and other writers that he admired. And his comment on this was, he couldn't imagine anyone ever taking a rose to a critic's grave.
So true. Oh, Kathy Patrick has been raising her arm. I'm so sorry. I don't know how I missed you.
Well, hi, this is Kathy Murphy down.
Kathy
I'm
Murphy.
sorry.
I'm sorry. I got that from Sandra.
Knows me both ways, but
Somehow I missed the only person with green hair back there. I'm so sorry. You look great.
I just wanted to say about Pat Conroy's books, first of all, that they're like your children. And so it's hard to say, which is your favorite child?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Every single one of these books is Pat Conroy's journey of figuring out his place in the world. And they were, for me, the books that helped me figure out who he's not alone. So when I read the manuscript of the Pat Conroy Mutual Sequence, it was unbound. And I got to a part where it was missing 10 pages.
Oh my God.
And I was just like, so upset. But
That's the worst.
that is the worst. But as I'm slowly meeting all the Pat Conroy people, I would totally agree that everything was believable. And most of the critics that, when the Beach Music book came out, that wrote about him in disparaging ways, were Northerners.
Yes. Yankees. Damn Yankees. But we love Yankees here. I do. Okay. It's not a Yankee though.
And that's why, for those of us that are here today, love his books because it's all about the story. We want all the details, and I don't think there are any better writers in the world than the South, Bloom, Welty. I mean, all my favorites, but Pat is number one.
Here. I think a lot of people in here would fight you for that title, but going on what she just said, there is a section in this Washington Post article that says, if Conroy is criticized for anything, it is for an excessive prose style. But his defenders say that comes mainly from cold academicians who are uncomfortable with real emotion. And then his old friend Doug Marlette, who's unfortunately no longer with us, is quoted here saying, I think of him like Moby Dick, and the critics are the crew of the Pequod. Marlette says, laughing, they're in their little boats and their eyes are darting around. The seagulls are circling and they're terrified of him, thinking, where is he going to sound? Then it says, for Conroy's part, he is unashamedly proud of his somersaulting language. There is a paragraph in The Prince of Tides that paints a vivid description of the Carolina Lowcountry. At the end is the sentence, my soul grazes like a lamb on the beauty of indrawn tides. Critics say, you just showed so well. Why tell? Why go one tick too far? Because that sentence is the favorite sentence I've ever written, he says, his head bobbing with each syllable. He's grinning with pride and a little mischief, and I wouldn't take it out because I expletive love that sentence. I can't just hear Pat saying that. I can. So yeah, Pat was unashamed of his flamboyant prose style, and I mean, who else writes like that? We have all the spare writers that we need. But we don't have that many Pat Conroys, and now we don't even have Pat Conroy, so I for one, am all about it. Okay, anybody else have a topic they'd like to cover besides Pat's prose style? Anything about this particular story that you liked? There were so many stories within stories. Any characters that you loathed or loved? I personally love Jordan, the bad boy surfer priest. That's like my perfect man. So I don't know. And Capers kind of made me cringe. Yes, Mary, I see your hand.
Jordan Marsh is still alive and lives in Columbia now.
Jordan, that this was based on?
Yes.
Really?
Yes.
Can I meet him?
Yeah. He's not a priest, but
Oh, shit. Well, that's okay.
hippie now.
That's okay. So that's who Jordan was based on? See, I don't know who all these people were based on. Somebody like Jonathan could probably come up and tell us. I know that the brothers are based on the brothers, and the mother is based on the mother, and Leah is probably based on Susanna, I would guess, Pat's youngest daughter. But I don't know who I know that Mike Hess is probably Bernie Shawn, kind of close to Bernie Shawn. Who else do we have? So Jordan, is somebody named Jordan Marsh, you're telling me?
His real name is Brett Bursey.
Because Jordan's Jordan Elliott, so you confused me. I thought maybe there was a real Jordan Marsh. So Brett Bursey? Bursey. Brett Bursey. I'm going to have to look him up. Is he on Facebook? What did y'all think, those who can remember and who have just read it, what did y'all think about that sort of courtroom scenario at the end where all the characters come back and put each other through a little, I guess it's Jordan's trial. Anybody enjoy that or find it unbelievable? No, nobody wants to talk about that. What did you think about the character of Jack McCall? Yes. Oh, that's a good question. He's asking if the chapters that got cut out were still here, would the book flow better? I think the book is intentionally, it goes back and forth in time, obviously. For me, that wasn't off-putting, but for some people, not having a straight narrative might have made it confusing. I don't remember those old chapters well enough to know. That's a good question, though. I just remember some of them being incredibly beautifully written, and there's one chapter about Italy, I think set in Rome, that I particularly remember that didn't make it. I think that I don't know if whole characters and storylines got cut out or not. In this WAPO article, there is an interesting part about how the editing process happened. Let me see if I can find it, because it's real interesting. It's about what happened. Oh, okay, here it is. I think I over-prepared here. We were talking about the winding, torturous process and all that, and how long it took him to write it. And it says, we're now talking to Dan Talese, his editor. It says, but his raw emotionalism is one reason why he is so popular, said his editor at Doubleday, Dan Talese. In his relations with his father, he is able to touch the heart of so many people by writing about shared emotional experiences, she said. They think Pat knows them and they sort of leap into his lap. These kept an increasingly impatient publisher. Talese kept an increasingly impatient publisher off Conroy's back while he dove back into his work after burying his brother Tom. But Talese herself was responsible for some late-inning drama. She had told Conroy to write beach music in the third person to separate the narrator's voice from that of Tom Wingo, the first-person narrator of The Prince of Tides. Pat had done so. But when he was nearly finished with the manuscript, Talese called Conroy at his home on Fripp Island. Pat, I have a shocking suggestion. If you say it's shocking, it must be terrible. The suggestion, rewrite beach music in the first person. Change every Jack McCall to I. A pause. I think you're right. Let's go ahead. I've always been more comfortable in the first person. So he had to do that. When Conroy finished beach music in January of this year, it was 2,100 pages. And Conroy writes in longhand because his father prohibited him from taking typing lessons in high school. Too sissy. Talese put aside all other editing obligations, holed up in her house, and began taking the manuscript apart, charting and blocking it like a series of storyboards. She would mark up 100 pages or so, then send them uptown to a hotel room where Conroy had checked in after coming from South Carolina. He'd make cuts, write bridges, plead to keep certain scenes. She stayed a couple of chapters ahead of him. It was like cramming for exams, she said, of the nearly 3-month process. It was a thrill to see the creative process up close, but sometimes he'd call and say, I have nothing to say except this is hard. And I'd say, I'm having trouble on chapter X, and then hang up. The process was productive, but sometimes painful. The death of Jack McCall's mother is based on the 1984 death of Conroy's mother, a subject still so hurtful to Conroy that Talese said he considered keeping it in third person. Also, the suicide based on his brother was cut from the book. It was too painful for him to finish. So that tells you a little bit about what a bear of a project this was, emotionally and just logistically speaking. And again, it had mixed reviews, more positive than negative, I think. It sold very well. It also was supposed to be made into a movie. In fact, I think somebody still owns the rights to the movie. For a long time, Brad Pitt was attached to play the character of Jack. Jonathan, do you know what has happened, or if anything? Yeah, I mean, do you think it could still happen, or just we've kind of given up on it?
I think there was, for a while, there was interest circulating in doing something more like a Netflix or an Amazon series.
Oh, that would make a great Netflix series because it's so long, and you could go to Poland during World War II, and you could go to South Carolina, and you could go to Rome. I'd watch that. Would y'all watch that? Yep. But see, I think now Brad Pitt is too old for the part, so who's gonna get that part? Somebody's raising their hand back there. Kathy? No? Oh, you'd see it, yeah. Wow, let's cast that. Okay.
I think it seems to be true, and you can tell me I'm wrong, that he had easier time writing about his father than he did writing about his mother.
That may be true. She asked if he had an easier time writing about his father than about his mother. I don't know. I think easy is a relative term. None of this was easy for Pat. It always ripped his heart out from what I know. And writing about his mother's death was very difficult because he adored his mother. But she was a complicated influence in his life, too. I mean, you can tell from the character of Lucy McCall. I'm not sure Pat's mother was quite that complicated. I unfortunately never met her. But, there's the character of Lila Wingo in The Prince of Tides, and then there's the character in The Great Santini. He always writes beautiful but complicated portraits of his mother. In this book, you've got not only his father, the judge, who is almost like a step up from some of the other fathers, but you've got that horrible father of Jordan, the general, who you kind of at the end, almost feel a little bit sorry for. He just can't break out of his rigid mindset, and he was so awful to Jordan when Jordan was young. He's turned Jordan into the man that he became for both good and ill. But I think at the end of the book they make amends, right? He goes to visit Jordan in prison where he's put Jordan. But Jordan did kill 2 people, so it's a very it's a very ambiguous storyline, that whole Jordan Elliot storyline, because he seems like a great boy who was warped by his father, but not warped that badly. I mean, he turned into a wonderful, loving, forgiving priest. It was interesting that he was always religious. Even when he was the wild hellion skateboarder, he was a religious boy. And Capers Middleton, I mean, how do we feel about him at the end? He apologizes for what he did, and he feels bad about it, but he also says, I couldn't have done anything else. When I was reading the part about Capers in college becoming a young radical with long hair, I was thinking, what? I'm not buying it. So it made perfect sense that he was actually undercover. For some of y'all who haven't read it, I'm sorry, I just sort of spoiled the whole plot, but I had forgotten even that. So as I read it, that was even a surprise to me. I mean, that's what's the fun of rereading a book after 25 years. You really don't remember the story. Y'all, we're coming up on the end of this session. Does anybody have, I literally have a ton of questions here, but I think I took up all the time talking about myself, so. Yes.
I have one question.
Yes.
Why do you feel that the description of place we always use the real name, in this case, for like Buford is writing about water?
Yeah.
The Isle of Oriana.
I think it's Fripp.
Why did he choose?
I don't know why he does that, because he doesn't always use the same names, but he does sometimes. Do you have any insight into that, Jonathan?
He would change place names so he could condense geography, could move things around, and wouldn't be beholden to the actual place.
Did you hear that? Yeah. So he can. Okay. Jonathan says that he would change place names so that he could do almost composites, so that he could move geography around and change certain things, and nobody would rear up and say, like, that's not what it's like in Beaufort. That's not exactly how Beaufort is laid out. But like in South Abroad, it is Charleston, and he calls it Charleston.
And he gets criticized for getting street directions wrong.
Oh, did he? Okay, I did not even know that. So that's probably why he, although I'm surprised he did go ahead and call it. I guess if you're going to call a book South Abroad, it has to be called Charleston. But I did not realize that he had criticism for that. Poor Pat. He always had a lot of criticism, and he never read his reviews, ever. Because he knew that if he believed the good one, he'd have to believe the bad ones too. And I'm the same way. I'm just a columnist, but I don't like to hear people don't like my work. Nobody likes that. But some people love to read their reviews. Like, they'll read it and say, hey, how can I get better? Or they'll say, I don't take this seriously. Well, Pat had a really tender heart. He could get real angry, and he was a righteous guy, but he was also very sensitive. He did not like criticism, which is why I couldn't have said half the things I'm saying in here right now if he were still alive. Because, I loved Pat. I never wanted to hurt his feelings, and he was always so incredibly generous and good to me, just like he was to about 500 other people around here that just happened to come into his orbit accidentally. Once you became his friend or got into his orbit, you were always in it. He would pull you back in, even if you were sort of too intimidated to try to get in. He just had the most generous heart. I don't want to cry. So anything else? I'm going over now. I feel like we haven't talked that much about beach music, but are there any specific questions that anybody has before we break for water and bathroom and all that good stuff? Yes?
A second time. What did the sea turtle represent?
What did the sea turtle represent? Wow. I feel like a sea turtle, maybe resilience. I haven't really thought about the metaphor, the loggerhead as metaphor. I know that Pat really loved, he loved working with the turtle people when he was living on Fripp Island, and I assume he saw it. Pat was always the champion of the victim, the champion of the weakling. And I bet he saw those little turtles as another version of that. You know, that they were endangered. They had a hard time surviving. Very rare that they do survive. So I would think that appealed to his love of the underdog, or the under turtle in this case. But I don't know. Anybody else have any thoughts on what the turtle symbolized? I think it was a great part of the story. It really showed you another side of Lucy's character. You know, that she was a defender of the underdog too. And what a story she had. Yes.
It could be related to the cycle of life.
Oh, absolutely.
And the struggle.
The cycle of life.
The struggle of life that the young turtles to get to the water in the beginning place, to live on, and the struggle that they had growing up.
Yes, absolutely. You're right. You're absolutely right. It reflects the struggle that the children of the McCalls had growing up and surviving and thriving. You know, it's a good mirror. You should be an English teacher. I used to know stuff like that back in the day. That was very thoughtful. Anybody else? No? Well, this is fun. I hope y'all enjoyed it.